The winter of 1812 rested like a weight upon Shropshire, cold and heavy, a season where slate roofs wept frost and the smoke from hearths clung low across the village green, refusing to rise. In that quiet English parish, where church bells carried farther than most dreams, the Whitmore name, once spoken with reverence by farmers and tradesmen alike, had already begun to curl under whispers like damp wood under ash. Eleanor Whitmore was scarcely 14 when she became a wife, a child in stature and soul, taken from the warm lap of girlhood and thrust into the brittle world of matrimony by a father whose debts exceeded his dignity. That arrangement, sealed over ledger pages and brandy, served neither affection nor family honor but economic survival in a nation trembling under Napoleonic wars and grain riots. The Whitmores had land but not solvency, lineage but not liquidity, and so Eleanor's fate became a line item on a creditor's bargain. Her husband, Silas Pembroke, was a widower nearly 3 decades her senior, a man whose waistcoat strained against his indulgence, and whose eyes bore the arrogance of ownership more than any flicker of paternal tenderness. In parlors and parish pews, the villagers watched the union with a mixture of pity and prudence, for in those days even tragedy could not outvoice propriety. The church blessed what it must, the law consented to what custom ordained, and a young girl became a wife as unceremoniously as one might be apprenticed to sorrow. In the early days of her marriage, Eleanor learned the grammar of silence the way other children learned embroidery. She moved like a pale apparition through Pembroke Hall, a house too large for its joy and heavy with the damp echoes of its previous mistress, whose portrait loomed over the staircase, eyes forever watching a life she had fled only through death. Eleanor's mornings were occupied with lessons in deportment rather than learning. She practiced curtsies, not curiosity, her childhood curiosity replaced by the rote rituals of hostess duties, meek compliance, and a quiet endurance expected of English wives, especially young ones with no fortune of their own. Servants, older women who rubbed chilblain ointment into their hands and whispered prayers beneath their breath, treated Eleanor with the pity reserved for lambs already led to altar stones. Their glances carried an unspoken prophecy. Endurance was not enough here. Pembroke's temper, sharpened by years of self-indulgence and unchallenged authority, revealed itself in ways subtle and cruel. A misplaced hairpin, a tepid cup of tea, a request answered too slowly. Each trivial slight summoned his disdain. He was a man who believed obedience was the purest form of devotion and correction, a duty of husbandry. England's laws agreed. A wife was property, a minor through marriage even if grown, a vessel for heirs and discipline both. Eleanor's bruises were rarely seen, not because they were absent but because the architecture of the era knew how to hide them. Lace cuffs, long sleeves, propriety, and fear formed a more permanent wardrobe than silk. Outside her gated world, Shropshire shifted restlessly. Bread prices soared. The echoes of Luddite hammers struck fear into mill owners. Newspapers carried tales of soldiers returning maimed from Spanish battlefields, while aristocrats toasted at assemblies. Society was a patchwork of unrest and pomposity, and Eleanor, in her gilded cage, absorbed it only through fragments of gossip at the market and the hushed tones of neighboring ladies who remarked on the folly of marrying girls barely out of childhood, even as they benefited from the same customs. If Eleanor's heart first hardened, it was not through a single cruelty, but through the slow erosion of hope, like stone weathered by a dripping roof. Each dinner where she sat silent beside Pembroke, each evening he dictated her reading as though she were a pupil rather than a spouse. Each time he seized her wrist to correct posture or tone, she felt some fragile part of her youth calcify into resolve. She studied him in silence the way a captive studies the turning of a lock, not out of submission but strategy. She learned his habits, his indulgences, the medicines he favored for his gout, the decanter he returned to night after night, amber liquor softening his voice only to sharpen his grip. She watched how he sneered at talk of women's education, how he mocked the occasional country preacher who dared suggest gentleness in marriage, how he boasted of his authority as though God himself had drafted the marriage contract on vellum and sealed it with thunder. Her solace came in stolen moments. In the kitchen, where the cook, Mrs. Barrow, spoke kindly and fed her sugared buns with the soft rebellion of a mother, feeding a secret hope. In the garden, where frost-bitten hedgerows reminded her that even vines seemed freer than she. In the pages of the banned pamphlets that circulated, among certain daring ladies, discussing Mary Wollstonecraft and the notion, scandalous, as fire in a library, that women were not merely appendages to men but beings with intellect and spirit. These seeds took root in her, watered by misery, lit by humiliation, and shielded by the protective veil of silence every oppressed woman learns to wear. If her childhood had been stolen, something else was given in exchange, a keenness, an awakening, an ember beneath ash waiting for wind. Meanwhile, Pembroke's cruelty grew not through escalation but repetition, the most insidious form of tyranny. His authority was constant, his neglect predictable, his humiliations casual. He did not rage so much as diminish, a sculptor of subservience who shaved away identity until only obedience remained. But Eleanor, though young, possessed a mind not easily erased. She memorized not just his cruelty, but the legal and social cage around her. She understood that escape was not physical. Where would she go? A girl with no income, no dowry, no protection in a legal system that would drag her back like runaway property. Escape in the conventional sense was impossible. So she waited as winter waits for its thaw, watching for opportunity not for flight but for dominance. For a reclamation of agency denied her. When sickness came for Silas Pembroke, it announced itself quietly, like all uninvited truths that change the course of a life. A cough here, a fever there, headaches he dismissed as peasant ailments unworthy of a gentleman. Yet his robust appetite waned, his voice cracked at supper, and Eleanor observed, her eyes cool as winter dawn. Consumption had claimed many in their parish. A man's wealth did not shield him from the fragility of lungs, from the slow drowning inside one's own body. In those days, sickness was a battlefield, and women, not physicians, held the line. It fell to Eleanor to manage his tonics, to administer laudanum, to summon physicians who muttered diagnoses in thick Latin and left more worried than honest. Pembroke trusted her hand because law and custom had long convinced him she was incapable of cunning. To him she was still the child bride, the pliant pupil, the fragile creature whose mind he believed too delicate for schemes. But in his illness he gave her the most precious weapon oppression can ever hand its subject, control over his vulnerability. That is when the whisper first entered her thoughts, not a shout of rebellion but a subtle murmur, an idea so quiet it could have been mistaken for instinct. What if freedom did not come through endurance or faith or societal mercy? What if justice, or what passed for justice in a world that denied her voice, had to be carved by one's own hand, even if blood stained the chisel? Years later, historians would say that England in 1812 teetered between eras, the old oppressive structures trembling as reform brewed in drawing rooms and factories alike. But for Eleanor Whitmore, the revolution stirring was not political nor economic. It was internal, molten, personal. A child bride molded into obedience now stood at the crossroads of grief, rage, and possibility. She had tasted helplessness long enough to recognize power when it arrived disguised as duty. In the stillness of Pembroke Hall, amidst the scent of medicine and damp stone, her heart did not beat with love or pity, but something colder and cleaner, a determination forged not from rage alone but from reason, sharpened by suffering. She would not run. She would not beg. She would not remain the silent wife history expected. She would decide her fate and his, with the precision of someone who had learned that survival was a strategy, not a gift. And like the winter frost that kills only to make way for spring, Eleanor understood that some lives must end for others to begin. And in the quiet corridors of the hall where her childhood died, she began to imagine a life not granted by mercy but seized by will, a future built not on escape but reclamation, Beneath the muted hush of Pembroke Hall, where the grandfather clock pronounced each passing second like a tribunal's gavel, Eleanor began her second education. This one not in deportment or domestic etiquette, but in mortality, power, and the arithmetic of consequences. Outside, the early spring of 1812 crept timidly through frost-crusted hedgerows. Yet inside the great house the air clung with sickbed heat and the metallic tang of medicine. Silas Pembroke's illness worsened in slow, deliberate degrees, not dramatic enough to summon scandal or priestly urgency, but persistent enough that every servant moved beneath the pall of future uncertainty. Eleanor attended him with a composure that startled even herself, hands steady as she measured tinctures and dampened cloths. She spoke little, her silence once a product of fear now repurposed into strategy. There was no sudden malice, no cinematic flicker of hatred in her eyes. Rather, there was calculation born of long suffering, A cold glacial clarity that arrives only after childhood has been forcibly stripped and replaced with survival instinct. If there had been any tenderness between bride and husband, it had died long before illness arrived. But Eleanor understood that widows in England were not made equal. Some inherited stability, others inherited ruin. A wife's duties, faithfully performed, placed her in proximity to authority. A widow's rights were determined by her conduct, her reputation, the faintest hint of impropriety. Therefore, she played her role with precision, an actress in a society that treated womanhood like a permanent audition for virtue. She knew neighbors watched. She knew servants whispered. She knew that grief, real or feigned, must eventually sit upon her shoulders like morning crepe, and so she practiced the expressions required of her, not out of deceit but necessity, a performance demanded by laws written by men who never imagined a woman might rewrite her own script. In those weeks, she absorbed every detail of the household's workings, every ledger account and supply ledger that Silas had once guarded with the arrogance of proprietorship. She learned which tenants owed rents, which harvests had failed, which investments in the London cotton market teetered precariously thanks to war and embargo. What she found was not the enviable fortune villagers imagined, but a strained estate burdened by ambition, exceeding acumen. Silas was not a steward of wealth, but a gambler with social pretense, and his declining health meant Eleanor inherited not comfort, but responsibility disguised as opportunity. She studied these ledgers by candlelight after nurses retired, fingers tracing sums with the same quiet concentration she once reserved for childhood books. Freedom, she realized, was not merely the absence of chains, but the possession of knowledge. Her father had sold her to maintain his estate. Now she saw that Pembroke sought to mask the slow collapse of his own. In a world where women rarely touched financial matters, she learned not out of love for the task, but because she had no intention of depending on mercy once widowhood arrived. If she was to claim a life beyond this hall, she would do so not as a drifting relic of misfortune, but as a woman armed with understanding. Still, each day required the tender ministrations of a dutiful wife, reading psalms at the bedside, measuring laudanum, responding to his commands with stiff composure. She began to note which dosages soothed and which weakened. Physicians came and went, pompous in their certainty but helpless in their results. They prescribed bleeding, mustard poultices, infusions of hartshorn, rituals of medicine more than remedies of science. Eleanor performed them meticulously, learning which treatments caused pain, which caused weakness, and which might hasten a decline without drawing suspicion. She never crossed the line. She merely memorized where it lay. For now, outside the household, rumors of social unrest seeped into parish talk, bread riots in Nottingham, more Luddite machines smashed in Midlands factories, pamphlets circulating about the rights of man and the cost of war. England felt as though it stood on a precipice, aristocratic certainties quivering as new philosophies brewed. Some whispered revolution like a fevered dream, though Britain's monarchy remained ironclad. These murmurings, though distant, fed Eleanor's imagination. If common men demanded dignity despite centuries of oppression, why should she, not merely a wife in body but a prisoner in spirit, settle for resignation? She began taking longer walks in the grounds, accompanied by a maid whose presence ensured propriety, yet whose sympathy offered quiet refuge. Mary, pale and small-voiced, spoke in hushed tones of her own sister forced into service at a mill to feed their family. "They throw girls to the machines like coal into furnaces," she once murmured, bitterness cracking her whisper. Eleanor did not respond then, but the sentiment lodged inside her like a secret vow. The world was not kind to women of any class. Privilege merely gilded the cage. But bars gilded still confined, and Eleanor would not remain caged. On these walks she studied the land. Frozen ponds losing their winter skins, oaks stirring under the promise of bloom, tenant cottages smoking faintly as families labored under growing desperation. Life around her moved with purpose. Nature endured cycles of death and rebirth. Why should she not claim her own season of renewal? She thought of all the women before her, child brides, silenced wives, mothers whose bodies served dynasties but whose voices never entered the record of history. Their suffering was polite, invisible, sanctified as duty. She, however, had tasted obedience and found it bitter. The idea of deliverance no longer frightened her. It tempted her with quiet insistence. Silas weakened, bedridden now, temper dulled not by humility but exhaustion. Gone was the booming voice commanding servants, replaced by rasped demands and fevered mutters. His skin sagged like parchment over bone. His once ruddy complexion turned ashen. He clung to his authority like a relic, insisting on dictating letters, reprimanding staff, and reminding Eleanor of her place, even as his breath rattled like wind through dead leaves. Yet the household sensed the shift of power. The butler deferred to her more readily. The steward brought accounts for her approval. Mrs. Barrow left extra bread and broth in the nursery-like sitting room Eleanor now used as her study, an act of maternal defiance against the old order. Eleanor never spoke of her intentions because there were none yet fully formed. Intent is not born whole but accumulates like sediment, layer upon layer of insult and awakening. She kept her mind steady, refusing to let hatred cloud judgment. If revenge stirred in her, it did so not with fury but with chilling rationality. She did not wish merely to escape Pembroke. She wished to emerge from this ordeal with her dignity and agency intact. She would not run to her father's house, trading one form of bondage for another. She would not fade into the obscurity allowed to disgraced widows. She would command her own life, if fate, law, and timing aligned. In the village, church sermons extolled patience and submission, especially for wives. Scripture was wielded like a bridle for spirits that dared buck against custom. Yet even the vicar's earnest warnings felt thin against the growing undercurrent of restlessness in society. Change was coming. Eleanor could feel it like a storm behind the hills. Women whispered more freely now, about education, about estate management when husbands were abroad at war, about the rights they lacked but yearned for. These conversations, though veiled in acceptable language, fed her resolve. One evening, reading to Silas as he drifted between wakefulness and fever, she encountered a passage in a medical manual discussing opiates and their measured use. Laudanum, praised for its power to ease suffering, held another darker capacity. If increased gradually unnoticed, fatal outcomes could be mistaken for disease's natural conclusion. A chilling clarity settled in her. She did not imagine immediate action. She did not rush. She observed, learned, prepared. Silas trusted her implicitly because society trained him to dismiss a woman's intellect. His arrogance was his vulnerability. The world had given him unchecked authority. Now illness placed his life in her hands. It was not poison she considered, but power. How fragile men became when stripped of their illusions of control. How the entire structure of patriarchy could collapse when its pillars weakened. As days lengthened and birds returned to the hedgerows, Eleanor practiced grief. Not hypocrisy, but anticipation. There was truth in her sorrow. Not for the man Silas was, but for the life she never had. For the childhood buried under silk gowns and bruised silence. For the girl who once believed goodness earned safety. At times she gripped the bedpost in the quiet night, breath trembling not from guilt but from the enormity of what she contemplated. Liberation requires the death of fear first. The rest follows. She imagined herself widowed, in black crepe, head bowed, receiving condolences while calculating budget, tenancy, legacy. She imagined herself speaking more confidently, walking with posture no longer shaped by obedience. She imagined a life where her mind belonged to her, where decisions did not require permission, where the world might never fully yield her equality, but where she carved enough space to breathe. In this vision there was no vengeance driven by rage. Instead there was reclamation, a balancing of scales in a world where men wrote laws to keep women indebted to suffering. And so with each passing day she tightened her control over the household and waited, not for opportunity but for certainty. Some revolutions ignite with gunpowder, others with patience sharpened into intent. For Eleanor Whitmore, emancipation would not arrive through mercy or miracle. It would be earned, calculated, and when the moment came, executed with composure befitting a woman denied a childhood, but determined to claim her future. Night thickened around Pembroke Hall like velvet drenched in sorrow, but inside a different darkness took shape. One not conjured by candlelit corners or whispering corridors, but by the slow realization that survival and righteousness were not always allies, that sometimes justice wore the cloak of ruthlessness to walk unchallenged in a world authored by men. As spring ripened into early summer, Silas Pembroke's illness spiraled, snaring him in cycles of fever, delirium, and bone-deep exhaustion. His voice, once an instrument of authority, now frayed into brittle threads of pleading masked as command. He demanded soups he could not stomach, decrees he could not enforce, and deference he could no longer command simply by existing. Eleanor tended him with practiced grace, her movements gentle, the way a gardener prunes a failing rose. Not with malice, but inevitability. Each measured drop of laudanum she offered came not from impulse but from calculation, sharpened by weeks of quiet observation. Increasing dosage was not yet her method. Instead, she allowed his disease and his own dependence on sedation to carry him slowly toward fragility. If she intervened, it was with restraint, nudging fate rather than seizing it violently. The world prized subtlety from women, and thus subtlety became her weapon. Beyond the sick-room walls, the estate breathed with the impatience of early harvest. Tenant farmers labored longer hours, their brows shining with honest sweat as wheat heads thickened, promising sustenance in a year stained by scarcity across the kingdom. News traveled on passing carts and gossiping servants, riots in Leeds, more machinery smashed, Parliament debating harsh sentences for seditious thought. War pressed heavily on every hearth. The wounded from the Peninsula campaign returned to English soil bringing tales of carnage, inspiring both patriotism and dread. Eleanor gleaned what she could, absorbing the political tremors not as idle curiosity, but as context for her own awakening. The nation cracked at its seams, ancient hierarchies trembling under hunger, war, and newfound voices daring to question divine right order. In this tension she found kinship. She too lived in a crumbling order, a structure that suffocated her but pretended to protect. The collapse she witnessed in Silas was not merely physical but symbolic. A man who once represented the authority of patriarchy, now reduced to wheezing breaths and desperate prayer whispered into linen he soiled with sweat and fear. His undoing was not triumphant to her. It was instructional. Power, when stripped, left a man not noble but terrified. In the rare hours she stepped outside, Eleanor felt the earth steady her resolve. She walked the orchard paths shadowed by apple boughs, their blossoms fallen like fragile truths carpeting the soil. There, away from nurse calls and heavy curtains, she allowed herself moments of unguarded thought. The future remained an unwritten page, frightening, liberating, demanding. Widowhood, she understood, was not inherently freedom. A widow's security balanced on legal documents and reputation. A misstep could make her prey in a society eager to redistribute female dependents like property shares. Thus she did not rush. She documented every aspect of Silas's decline in elegant handwriting, maintaining meticulous logbooks of his symptoms and doses, a record that would protect her should questions arise. Women in her world could not simply act. They had to lay foundations, create narratives acceptable to society's unforgiving gaze, orchestrate innocence even while reaching for autonomy. Servants noticed her poise, her unwavering calm. Mary whispered at kitchen tables of how the mistress has become steel. Mrs. Barrow defended Eleanor against the suspicions of those who believed youthful beauty sought rapid liberation. She is dutiful, the cook insisted, kneading dough as though molding fate. God sees the heart even if men misread it. But humans rarely saw hearts clearly. They measured virtue by performance. Eleanor understood this better than anyone. She did not rehearse grief now, she practiced preparedness. When Silas moaned her name in fever dreams, she stroked his hand but felt no tremble in her own. When he accused her of watering his wine, she lowered her lashes not because shame touched her, but because obedience remained her temporary armor. The weight she carried was not guilt, but the burden of choosing between living and merely existing. If she ever feared consequence, she buried that fear beneath colder logic. What was punishment compared to a lifetime of sanctioned subjugation? The physician who visited weekly, Dr. Reeves, represented the complacent arrogance of his profession, a man who equated bloodletting with wisdom and dismissed female observation as emotional speculation. He lectured Eleanor on Silas's delicate constitution, as though she had not watched her husband's strength erode grain by grain like sand wasting through an hourglass. Reeves prescribed further opiates, praising their palliative value, oblivious to how perfectly his ignorance aligned with Eleanor's silent plan. Better to ease his suffering, he remarked once, staring gravely at Silas's frail form, than prolong agony. Those words etched themselves in Eleanor's mind like scripture rewritten for women whose lives scripture forgot. Ease his suffering, prolong agony. The boundary between mercy and liberation blurred so easily when men spoke with divine confidence about life and death, as though God conferred his judgment exclusively through their mouths. Eleanor absorbed his tone, his logic. If men believed alleviating suffering sacred, who could condemn a woman for understanding that principle more intimately? One humid afternoon, when thunderheads gathered over Shropshire fields and air hung thick with impending rain, Eleanor encountered a moment that crystallized her resolve. Silas, half lucid, begged for more laudanum. Begged. The man who once commanded her every posture, now reduced to pleading for relief from a body that failed him. She measured the tincture, dropping amber liquid into the spoon, and paused only long enough to witness the transformation within herself. Once she would have felt pity. Now she felt a quiet, solemn clarity. Pity belonged to innocence. Clarity belonged to survival. She offered the dose, steady hand, steady breath, steady conscience. He swallowed greedily, his grip on her wrist momentarily desperate, his eyes wide with primal fear disguised poorly as gratitude. He whispered, "You are a good wife." The lie, or the truth as he perceived it, hung between them like a veil. She had performed goodness so convincingly that even he, in his final unraveling, mistook obedience for devotion. And in that moment, Eleanor did not feel monstrous. She felt powerful in a way denied to women by both law and religion. She was not killing him. He was dying, and she was guiding the descent, ensuring it occurred on her terms, with her hand steady rather than ringing helplessly in prayer. Evenings brought a strange peace to the estate. Candles flickered against wainscoting, the ticking clock a quiet metronome marking Silas's dwindling time. Eleanor read medical texts now with fervor, not for lethal instruction but for legitimacy. Knowledge shielded her better than innocence ever could. Women who survived in silence rarely shaped their destiny. Women who understood the systems around them could bend them inch by inch, until freedom resembled privilege rather than rebellion, and freedom was her aim. Not vengeance, not destruction, simply the right to exist unowned, the right to breathe without permission. Each night before retiring, she walked past the portrait of Silas's first wife, Elizabeth, a solemn woman trapped forever in paint, her eyes hollow with a life half-lived. Eleanor did not envy her memory, but she recognized the echo between them. Marriage for both had meant sacrifice, but unlike Elizabeth, Eleanor refused to allow death to be the only release granted to women of their station. She would not be another portrait staring plaintively from a gilded frame, her life summarized by marital status and silence. Rain eventually fell, drumming against glass like impatient fingers demanding reckoning. Outside, crops drank relief from oppressive heat, while inside, Silas drifted further from the tether of life. He slept more, spoke less, his breath shallow waves receding from shore. Eleanor sat near him, needle in hand, stitching mourning linen not because she wished his death but because she planned to meet it prepared. Her stitches were precise, methodical, each loop a declaration that she would claim dignity even in sorrow. Widowhood approached like a season, foretold by signs she alone arranged with patience and precision. No hidden vial, no sudden collapse, just the slow surrender of a man whose authority once seemed unassailable. And with each passing hour she felt her own rebirth begin, not in triumph but in solemn metamorphosis. Liberation is rarely a symphony. It is often a quiet unthreading of chains, one link at a time. When she finally rose from her sewing chair, stretching her cramped fingers, she glanced once more at Silas, his breath shallow, his face slack. Not yet, she thought. Not from hesitation, but because timing mattered more than desire. A widow too eager invited suspicion. A wife who waited earned sympathy, and Eleanor Whitmore would have sympathy as armor and autonomy, as inheritance. For in a world where law refused to imagine women capable of strategy, her greatest rebellion was not the act itself, but the intelligence guiding it. She extinguished the candle, leaving the room bathed in the murky silver of moonlight, and walked the corridor with steps neither triumphant nor fearful. Justice in her life was not defined by courts or clergy. It was defined by survival. And survival demanded patience, discipline, and the willingness to become what the world feared most. A woman who understood her own power and refused ever again to relinquish it. Summer settled over Shropshire with a heavy, breathless stillness, the kind that pressed heat into the earth and made tempers short. Thoughts restless and secrets cling like humidity to skin. At Pembroke Hall, the season wrapped itself around the estate in languid haze. Birdsong dulled beneath the weight of sweltering afternoons, servants moving slower as though the house itself demanded quiet reverence for the struggle unfolding inside its walls. Silas Pembroke now lived in the narrowing corridor between life and death, his body failing in slow increments, each day peeling away another layer of strength until only fragility remained. Eleanor moved through this atmosphere like a measured ghost, not drifting but purposeful, her stillness the calculated calm of a strategist rather than the passivity of a child bride she once was. Where once she would have flinched at every barked order, every impatient knock of silver spoon against porcelain, she now felt a strange ascendancy. Silas's world had shrunk to his bed, while hers expanded with every quiet decision, every record kept, every whisper of estate matters deferred to her because there was no one else able to assume the mantle. Authority, she discovered, did not always come by force. Sometimes it grew in the shadow of another's decline. The servants, long accustomed to Silas's temper and Eleanor's suppression, adopted a new manner around her, one tinged with cautious respect. The butler, Mr. Harrow, still addressed her with the deferential tone reserved for mistresses of consequence. But now his deference lingered, as though recognizing that his livelihood might one day rest in the hands of the young woman he once pitied. Even Mrs. Barrow, stout and blunt, softened in her interactions, offering Eleanor meals she barely touched, soothing tonics she rarely needed, and affectionate clucks of maternal concern that carried the tone of validation Eleanor had yearned for since childhood. Yet Eleanor did not bask in their sympathy. She accepted it as a woman might accept a shawl placed over her shoulders, warm, comforting, useful, but not transformative. Sympathy might grant her gentleness in the eyes of others, but it would not secure her future. So she balanced empathy with precision, affection with vigilance. She made sure that her presence in Silas's chamber never felt excessive nor negligent, that every instruction she gave to servants was framed as duty, not authority, that no guest or neighbor saw her posture as anything but dignified endurance. She was not merely tending a dying husband. She was curating a reputation, one thread at a time, knowing that widows who commanded both pity and respect navigated society's suspicion more safely than those who displayed ambition too brazenly. Silas's decline brought moments of lucidity, cruel in their clarity. On certain mornings he awoke with a spark of his former self, irritable, imperious, clinging to remnants of authority with the desperation of a drowning man clawing for shore. In those intervals he spoke sharply, reminding Eleanor of her duties, her place, her obligations, as though trying to reassert a world already dissolving beneath him. "Do not forget what is expected of you," he rasped one afternoon, fingers trembling as he pointed toward the prayer book on his bedside table. God sees, society sees. The irony, sharp as vinegar, did not escape Eleanor. A man who lived devoid of grace now clung to morality when his power evaporated. She nodded with practiced humility, lowering her gaze though her mind did not bow. He saw duty. She saw opportunity disguised as ritual. She read aloud when he demanded scripture, not from devotion, but because reading nurtured her patience. She knelt when he required piety, not out of reverence but to study his breathing, his pulse, the fragile rhythms of a body running out of time. Every moment was a calculus, when to serve, when to observe, when to wait. Fate was not a storm she braved. It was a loom she learned to weave. Yet in private hours, when Silas slept and the house exhaled in fatigue, Eleanor confronted the internal landscape of her transformation. Freedom, she realized, was not simply the absence of a tyrant. It required dismantling the remnants of compliance embedded by years of subjugation. Sometimes she questioned herself, not out of moral hesitation but existential uncertainty. What life awaited her once the chains were severed? Who was she apart from survival? The world offered few examples of independent womanhood. Widows either remarried for protection or lived under the guardianship of male relatives, their autonomy tolerated only if discreet. But Eleanor had seen glimpses of possibility. Wealthy widows in London who managed estates and salons, governesses who published poetry under initials, women who inherited property and learned to negotiate contracts with legal ferocity behind lace gloves. These images flickered in her imagination like lanterns in fog, illuminating not a clear path but an attainable horizon. She whispered to herself not affirmations of innocence but promises of competence. She would become a woman whose intellect commanded respect, not a relic of tragedy wrapped in perpetual mourning. To that end, she immersed herself further in estate affairs. She studied crop reports with the steward, listened to tenant grievances, and walked the fields at dusk, soil warm beneath her slippers, inspecting the condition of barley and wheat as though she had been born to land management. She learned which families struggled with illness, which needed seed, which owed arrears due to harsh winter scarcity. These observations were not sentimental but strategic. If she was to inherit, she would inherit with understanding. It was during one such walk that she overheard two tenant women drawing water from the communal well. Their conversation drifted through humid air, the vicar's sermon chastising rebellious wives, rumors of a local girl beaten by her husband for questioning his wages, whispers of a farmer's widow forced to remarry his brother to retain shelter. Eleanor paused unseen, the bucket rope creaking as women labored. Their world echoed her own, different in economy but identical in chains. It was then she realized that her personal rebellion formed part of something larger, a quiet revolution not spoken of in Parliament, but lived in kitchens and fields, in bruised wrists and hushed tears, and the gradual refusal of the soul to accept bondage disguised as duty. If she succeeded, she would carve a path, not wide, not flamboyant, but real. Not for every woman, perhaps, but at least for herself. Silas's final weeks blurred into a choreography of ritual and inevitability. Physicians increased visits, offering ever more elaborate remedies that masked desperation as knowledge. Laudanum bottles diminished faster now, though never suspiciously so. Illness advanced naturally enough that none imagined assistance guiding it. Eleanor administered his doses with steady hand, ensuring comfort, ensuring progression, ensuring no suffering long enough to spur conscience or doubt. If this was mercy, it was mercy forged in the crucible of oppression, tempered by necessity, sharpened by intellect. As his strength ebbed, his authority shrank to memory, and Eleanor found it easier to breathe. She sat beside him, not as a frightened girl but as a woman witnessing the passing of an era, not just his life but the power he embodied. Sometimes she sang softly, lullabies she half remembered from childhood, tunes her mother once hummed before poverty drove tenderness from their household. Silas seemed soothed by the sound, though whether he mistook her song for devotion or simply found comfort in human presence no longer mattered. Death approached without fury, only inevitability, and she met it not with triumph but solemnity. One evening, as twilight filtered through muslin curtains and cicadas hummed their melancholy hymn, Silas looked at Eleanor with rare clarity. For a fleeting moment his gaze held not command or contempt but something resembling surrender. His lips parted as though to speak a confession or plea, but no words came, only a shallow breath and the faint tightening of his fingers around hers. In that instant, Eleanor felt no cruelty, no victorious pulse. She felt the weight of choice and consequence settle finally into certainty. She murmured nothing, offering instead the quiet presence denied to her in her own moments of childhood fear. Power did not require gloating, it required composure. When his grip slackened and sleep reclaimed him, she rose carefully, not disturbing the stillness. Tomorrow or soon after, the world would know. But tonight, she allowed herself a single exhale of relief, not because suffering ended but because autonomy drew near enough to touch. The household slept while she walked the dim hallways, fingers brushing carved paneling, her footsteps steady, unhurried. She passed portraits of Pembroke ancestors, stern faces painted to immortalize authority, legacy, dominance. They watched, from gilded frames as though expecting obedience from generations beyond their own. Eleanor met their stares without flinching. Patriarchy did not end with a death, nor did freedom bloom instantly. Yet she felt something unshackled in her chest, as though a door long barred had creaked open. She paused at a window overlooking moonlit fields, the expanse serene and infinite. Soon, she thought, her life would unfold in chapters she authored, but she did not rush hope. She let it settle deliberately, like dust on polished wood, gradually forming a layer no hand could wipe away. In silence, she embraced the truth she had cultivated with patience and intellect. She had not merely survived inward, she had transformed. Dawn would come, death would follow. And when the mourning veil draped her shoulders, it would not clothe sorrow alone but sovereignty, quiet and resolute. The child bride had dissolved into memory. The widow waited, poised to emerge, not broken, but reborn. The clergyman's voice faded into the wind long ago, but Eleanor still carried the weight of that church, its damp stones pressing against her ribs as if the vows had never ceased echoing. In this new season, when lambs bleated in pastures and hedgerows came alive with hawthorn blossoms, the world pretended at rebirth while she lived among ghosts. Widowhood was supposed to free a woman from male governance, at least in the eyes of genteel rhetoric and sentimental novels that romanticized female endurance. Yet here she stood, 16 and encircled by grief, debt, suspicion, and the cold stare of a society trained to police a woman's place. Even mourning garments, the heavy black serge and crepe, felt less like a badge of sorrow and more like shackles, marking her as a vessel once owned, now emptied, a problematic remnant of a marriage much older than she ever was. Spring in Hampshire had never seemed crueler. Beneath the surface of budding growth lay rot, hidden scandals, swallowed truths, unspoken bruises. Eleanor walked through Whitmore Manor's shadowed corridors not as its lady but as an interloper waiting to be displaced by men calculating her worth in legal terms, not human ones. Thomas Whitmore's death had been declared misadventure, a gentleman's unfortunate accident in the dark, though whispers trailed Eleanor like hungry dogs. Tongues in drawing rooms wagged with morbid fascination. A girl wife, a sudden widow, a fall on the staircase that snapped bone like twigs after rain. Too convenient, muttered some. Divine intervention, murmured others. Wickedness disguised in innocence insinuated those who craved scandal more than truth. Even the servants, once submissive in Thomas's presence, now observed her with a subtle shift, a questioning, a curiosity tinged with reverence or fear. They knew the bruises she hid, the muffled cries behind doors, the hurried footsteps at night. Household staff in such estates were repositories of domestic secrets, and they had watched a child be transformed into a wife, then into a ghost of herself, and now into something new, sharpened, silent, resolute. London newspapers had reported the death briefly, with polite detachment calling Thomas Whitmore a respected gentleman of established lineage. They did not print the other truths, the unpaid gambling debts, the visits to gaming hells, the unpaid wages to tenant farmers, the predatory eye that saw in Eleanor not a partner but property, collateral, proof of status. Her father had bartered her into a marriage contract like a dowry ledger, eager to secure rising ties with rural gentry. She remembered that day as one remembers the moment a snare snaps shut. A silk ribbon in her hair, the scent of beeswax polish, servants bustling, and her father's tight grip at her back forcing her forward, and Thomas, smiling like a fox at a henhouse door. It was not love, it was transaction, power, inheritance, the architecture of English patriarchal order in its purest form. Now that architecture shook under her feet, but not from her own agency. Not yet. Thomas had fallen, cracked like the marble busts in the Manor's gallery when frost seeped in one winter. Yet the societal mechanism that enabled him remained intact. Gears turning to reposition Eleanor toward another male guardian. Letters arrived from Thomas's brother in London, suggestions that she should move to town, reside under his protection, surrender control of the estate until lineage questions were settled. Estate stewards spoke in coded language, as if her existence needed translation through men to carry legitimacy. The law, the same law that allowed a child to be wed to a man twice her age without her consent, now rendered her at risk of being deemed incapable of managing property. Coverture still clung like a corpse's hand to her wrist. Marriage had erased her identity, and widowhood only half restored what had never been allowed to fully form. Yet something else grew in her, something raw and unscripted, like a storm swelling over the channel. Nights stretched long, and sleep was restless, broken by flashes of memory. Thomas's hand clamping around her arm, the way he spoke of duty and obedience, the suffocating sense of being bred for compliance. But there were also new images. Born only after his death, the moment his boot slipped on the polished stair, the widening eyes, the silence that followed. She had watched, frozen and yet strangely aware, as if time had gifted her clarity and cruelty. She had not pushed, she had not pulled, she had simply been present, and the universe had tipped in her favor for once. Fate, justice, or coincidence, whichever name fit. The inquest never asked whether a girl whose ribs still ached from former blows might allow herself one brief second of hesitation before calling for help. And even if they had, would they have cared? Men's violence was routine, women's resistance was unforgivable. That she lived at all was remarkable. That she breathed freely now felt dangerous. Her days unfolded with the quiet choreography of necessity. She rose early, visited the estate tenants, listened to their needs, something Thomas rarely bothered with. Her presence among them, face flushed from the chill of morning fields, bonnet ribbons fluttering in damp wind, was startling to those accustomed to aristocratic indifference. They saw a young widow kneeling to inspect failing fences, speaking with shepherd boys, handing coins to a mother whose infant coughed weakly in her arms. Rumors shifted bit by bit. Perhaps she was not wicked. Perhaps she was simply surviving. Some tenant women whispered of what they had endured in marriages, exchanging glances heavy with unspoken solidarity. They recognized the steeled posture of someone who had walked through private torment. Compassion from those deemed lesser by society's hierarchy carried more warmth than all the condolences from genteel acquaintances who visited only to satisfy morbid curiosity and ensure the scandal did not outgrow the parameters propriety could stomach. Inside the house, Eleanor reclaimed small freedoms. She entered rooms Thomas had banned her from, touching mahogany surfaces he once forbade her hand to rest upon, opening desk drawers that had been locked. She found letters, proof of debts, crude notes from gambling companions, hints of affairs with women he paid and abandoned. Every revelation eroded the last vestige of guilt she might have carried. He had never been a gentleman in conduct, only in name. Victorians would later cloak such men in tragic romanticism. But here in 1812, his brutality was plain, documented in ink and bruises. Now his absence created a vacuum, and in that vacuum Eleanor breathed with cautious hunger. At night, candlelight flickered across her journal, pages filling faster than ever before. She documented everything, the estate accounts, tenant grievances, personal reflections, memories she had once buried. Not because she expected anyone to read them, but because reclaiming narrative was as vital as air. Words were weapons sharper than Thomas's temper. She wrote of girlhood stolen, of the crushing silence of marital subordination, of moments she swallowed her own voice to avoid harm. She wrote the truth history seldom acknowledged, that marriage for many young women in England was not sanctuary but confinement, legal, emotional, corporeal. The clergy preached domestic virtue. Philosophers praised feminine obedience. Satirists mocked women who sought autonomy. But in candlelit solitude, Eleanor allowed herself fury without shame, clarity without fear. Society's watching eyes grew restless. Months had passed, and still she had not retreated into the guardianship her in-laws proposed. Subtle threats emerged, inquiries about her capacity, comments on her youth implying incompetence, suggestions she remarry quickly to restore order. What they feared was not incompetence but independence, a young widow controlling land, money, and narrative that unsettled centuries of custom. Even her own father expressed discomfort, writing stiffly about propriety and the importance of aligning oneself with family guidance. The same father who had traded her life for prestige now sought to reassert dominion. She did not reply. Silence, once forced upon her, had become her chosen blade. She allowed them to underestimate her, allowed their impatience to ferment into carelessness. They were men trained to assume women bent easily. Revenge, if it could be called that, did not blossom in sudden fury but in calculated awakening. It was not Thomas's death. That had been fate's intervention, not her hand. Her vengeance would be measured in autonomy, in breaking inheritance patterns, in safeguarding those beneath her in hierarchy. She met discreetly with the steward, drafting plans to modernize estate operations, to forgive certain tenant arrears Thomas had ignored, to establish schooling for local children. Radical for the time? Yes, dangerous, certainly. A woman steering economic decisions threatened the invisible architecture of patriarchy more than any physical act ever could. She understood this. She leaned into it. In the village, rumor began to evolve again. Some called her benevolent, others cunning. Men whispered that a woman wronged could become unpredictable, but they misunderstood her entirely. Eleanor was not ruled by vengeance. She was fueled by reclamation. Of self, of voice, of a future Thomas had tried to dictate but failed to own. She walked through meadows where primroses nodded in the breeze, felt the sun warm her face without someone monitoring her steps, and tasted freedom like bread after famine. Yet beneath the calm lay readiness because she knew the world did not surrender power to women without resistance. Forces would come. Legal claims, moral accusations, familial pressure, they brewed like storm clouds. But Eleanor had endured storms before, and now she recognized lightning not as destruction but illumination. Night deepened, and in the quiet of the manor she paused at the foot of the staircase, those polished steps gleaming faintly in moonlight. Memory stirred, neither triumph nor guilt but solemn acknowledgement. That was the moment her life forked between slavery and breath, between being property and becoming person. She did not touch the banister. She merely watched the shadows and whispered unspoken vows to herself, not to a man or a church or a state, but to her own fractured spirit. I will not be owned again. The house held its silence. Outside, an owl cried across the fields, ancient and knowing. Tomorrow would bring battles, subtle, strategic, relentless. And Eleanor, once a child bride silenced by law and custom, now moved with deliberate poise. She would preserve her legacy, defend her autonomy, and reshape the land Thomas had misruled not through rage but through order, intellect, and unyielding resolve. The age demanded quiet compliance. She offered quiet rebellion instead. Dawn arrived muted, filtering through gauze curtains like a hesitant confession, and Eleanor greeted it not with serenity, but with calculation. Freedoms won tentatively could vanish if she misstepped, and each passing day brought new friction between her aspirations and the patriarchal structure she navigated. Whitmore Manor, once a gilded cage, was now her battleground, quiet halls heavy with potential. She had begun to reorganize ledgers, consult stewards, and meet tenants not as a child wife, but as a landholder poised to govern. Yet society did not yield to a woman's evolution easily. Suspicion clung to her like morning crepe, and even the kindness she extended was dissected for motive. Rumors swirled that she manipulated tragedy for power, that she was too composed for a girl so recently widowed. When she signed estate documents with steady hand, men watched with narrowed eyes. When she spoke of planting new barley and investing in improved plowshares, their surprise betrayed how deeply they believed in her ignorance. A woman with knowledge was dangerous. A woman with purpose was incendiary. Her power was not loud, but it was precise, and in that precision lay threat. Still she persisted, each decision a stone laid upon the foundation of a life she was building for herself, rather than having built around her. In the surrounding parishes, gossip rode the church pews like restless spirits. Mothers tugged daughters closer when Eleanor passed, unsure whether to personify her as caution or curiosity. Parson Fletcher, with his clipped sermons and distrust of female autonomy, hinted obliquely about Eve's temptation and the peril of women left unchecked by righteous guardianship. He did not name Eleanor, yet every glance directed toward her pew spoke loudly. She sat straight, gloved hands resting unmoving as Scripture weaponized patriarchal order around her. Her grief was questioned, her strength pathologized. A good widow, as society defined, wilted. Eleanor did not wilt. She rooted. Outside the church walls, she studied agricultural pamphlets, consulted with tenant farmers whose hands bore soil like second skin, and wrote letters to London requesting legal clarification on estate authority. Letters she signed without asking permission. She discovered threads of agency and pulled gently, aware that tugging too hard could unravel everything. Women in England rarely wielded power publicly, but private influence had always been the hidden current of female survival. She intended to master both currents. Her father arrived without announcement, carriage wheels muddy from miles traveled, his mouth already set in disapproving lines. His presence brought the haunting scent of her former life, drawing rooms perfumed with expectation, childhood obedience, and silenced dreams. Sir Alistair Whitmore greeted him with cordial civility, but undertones simmered. Two men, each convinced they held rightful claim to Eleanor's future, circled her in polite gestures and veiled legal references. She poured tea with the practiced grace of a girl trained for domestic presentation, while their voices fenced over her head like duelists. Her father emphasized duty. Her brother-in-law quoted property statutes. Both spoke as though she were absent. Though she sat between them breathing steadily, they believed themselves custodians of her welfare. In truth, they were custodians of their own comfort within a system that depended on women's containment. Each insisted she relocate, her father to her childhood home, Sir Alistair to London. Her refusal was soft but steel-lined. She smiled faintly, thanked them for counsel, and repeated that the estate needed her presence. Their annoyance hid beneath paternal tones, yet she recognized it. Men unaccustomed to disobedience always masked outrage with sanctimony first. After they left, Eleanor stood in the Manor's long gallery, staring at portraits of stern Whitmore ancestors painted in oils and arrogance. Generations of men who believed land and blood were theirs to command gazed down at her with perpetual entitlement. She felt their scrutiny like heat against the skin, yet did not bow before it. Instead, she traced their frames, absorbing the lineage she now tethered. She did not reject legacy. She intended to redefine it. In a drawer, she found Thomas's old correspondence with political acquaintances, filled with empty bluster and aspirations he never realized. Reading them brought a strange peace, not satisfaction in his failure, but liberation in understanding that his power had always been brittle bark without solid wood beneath. Patriarchy relied not on true might, she thought, but on the obedience of those beneath it. Remove obedience and the structure shook. She was not naive. She knew resistance would incite reprisal, but preparation steadied her. She studied inheritance law deeper, contacted a solicitor known quietly to advocate for widows, and built alliances not with aristocrats, but with local families who depended on the estate for livelihood. Practical loyalty, she realized, was stronger than blood loyalty. Lives tied to the land trusted her more than relatives tied only to tradition. Through late spring and into early summer, Eleanor walked the grounds as though reacquainting herself with a world she was once forbidden to explore freely. The river hummed with life, reeds swaying under the watch of waterfowl, sunlight catching on ripples like liquid pewter. She sat by its banks, skirts spread like dark silk across damp grass, and contemplated futures once unimaginable. Yet contemplation did not erase memory. As lilies bloomed, flashes of Thomas's temper returned. Moments of slammed doors, breath drawn in fear. The bitter isolation that lived behind pretty wedding vows. She allowed the memory, did not shrink from it. Power came not from forgetting, but from surviving with clarity. One afternoon she encountered Mrs. Briggs, a tenant's wife who limped from an old injury inflicted by a drunken husband. They exchanged quiet nods heavy with mutual understanding. Neither spoke openly of violence, but the recognition was palpable. Women carried unrecorded histories in their bones. Eleanor felt herself part of that unspoken archive now. She vowed silently that the estate would not tolerate such cruelty under her governance. That too was rebellion, not fire or blade, but policy, protection, precedent. Whispers among the gentry thickened as Eleanor's determination solidified. Invitations to social calls dwindled, replaced by watchful inquiries and polite warnings about impropriety. Ladies who once simpered beside her now avoided conversation, fearing association with a woman who acted outside prescribed grief. She overheard one remark that she behaved as though she were a gentleman in petticoats. It amused her more than it wounded. If competence looked masculine to them, their blindness was their own failing. Still, she knew reputational threat carried real consequences. A woman deemed unstable or morally deviant could be legally restrained, her assets transferred to male control. She planned accordingly, kept careful records, cultivated credibility with clergymen supportive of charity efforts, and ensured tenant improvements were visible enough to garner local respect. Reputation, she understood, was armor, not flashy but necessary for battle in drawing rooms disguised as diplomacy. Evenings found her writing, quill scratching steadily across parchment, not elegies to lost love but strategies for survival and reform. She wrote about the right to solitude, the quiet dignity of labor, the violence of forced innocence. Her thoughts stretched beyond herself to girls she had seen married too young, to mothers hollowed by childbirth and subjugation, to widows who lost inheritance to brothers-in-law because parliamentarians decided women lacked reason. She envisioned future generations where daughters would inherit freely, choose freely, learn freely, radical ideas for 1812. Yet history did not evolve through complacency. In her letters she quoted Wollstonecraft cautiously. Even an echo of such philosophy risked scrutiny, but Eleanor was careful, never reckless. Her resistance wore lace gloves, though its core was iron. Then came word. Sir Alistair petitioned the magistrate, citing Eleanor's youth as grounds for oversight of the estate. It was the first open shot in a conflict brewing beneath teacup civility. The courier delivered the notice in the garden where Eleanor stood pruning roses, thorns pricking through thin gloves. A symbolic sting, reminder that beauty coexisted with peril. Her breath caught not from fear but from recognition. The storm she anticipated had arrived. She read the formal script, signed with official seal, and felt heat coil beneath her ribs. Fuel, not panic. He believed law would cage her. He underestimated how thoroughly she had studied its locks. She called for her solicitor that afternoon, pacing the drawing room with controlled urgency. Windows framed bright summer light, yet tension shadowed the walls. This was not solely her fight. It was emblematic of every woman bound by paternal authority, masquerading as protection. She would contest the petition legally, strategically, decisively, not with scandalous theatrics but with evidence of competency, tenant testimonies, financial records, and impeccable decorum. If they expected hysterics, she would offer precision. Night deepened once more, and Eleanor stood by the same staircase where fate had first shifted. She touched the polished wood lightly, acknowledgement, not reverence. Thomas's ghost held no power here. Only memory did, and memory now served her, not imprisoned her. Wind murmured against the windows as though the world itself whispered caution or encouragement. She could not yet tell. But she felt centered in a way she never had as a daughter or bride. Widowhood, instead of diminishing her, had forged her. Revenge, she realized, was not the fall of a man, nor the suffering of those who had wronged her. It was the reclamation of life denied, the construction of identity where only obedience was once permitted. And now, with the magistrate's challenge looming, she readied herself not as a frightened girl but as a woman stepping fully into her own narrative. The season had turned. So had she. Fire could destroy, but it could also temper steel. In the hush of the estate night, Eleanor Whitmore was no longer the child bride nor the silent wife. She was resolve given form, and she understood the truth patriarchy feared most. A woman who survives learns not only how to endure, but how to win. Autumn crept in without grandeur, settling over Hampshire with a quiet that felt almost ceremonial, as if the earth itself paused to witness the culmination of a struggle not recorded in state papers or parliamentary ledgers, but no less seismic. Leaves browned and curled like old correspondence, hedgerows thinned and mist hugged the pastureland in pale veils at dawn. Eleanor walked through this shifting season steady as a metronome, neither hurried nor hesitant. The fatigue of months of vigilance etched subtly beneath her eyes, yet counterbalanced by a power she no longer borrowed but possessed. The petition hearing had become the fulcrum on which her fate balanced, a meticulous choreography of credibility, evidence, restraint, and strategy. Days before the proceeding, she pored over estate ledgers one last time, fingers tracing copperplate entries she herself had added, the ink still young, though the legitimacy it represented felt ancient in her bones. She had visited tenants, gathered letters affirming her stewardship, and prepared affidavits quietly backed by local tradesmen, and even the vicar from the neighboring parish who, unlike Parson Fletcher, judged righteousness not by gender but by conduct. Women rarely commanded such a coalition. Rarer still were they allowed to do so openly. Eleanor did it discreetly, as one learning to thread power through seams no one thought to inspect. When the day arrived, the magistrate's hall smelled of parchment, wood polish, and damp wool coats, a congregation of male authority preserved in architecture and attitude. Eleanor entered not as supplicant but as presence, her mourning attire softened to half-mourning gray crepe, signaling not disregard for her past, but refusal to remain trapped in it. Sir Alistair stood stiff, jaw clenched, sure of victory through precedent and presumption. He spoke first, outlining his claim under the guise of familial duty and concern, painting Eleanor with polite diminishment, a young lady of tender years, in need of guidance in matters of property and finance. Every phrase was a silken chain, He cited tradition masquerading as safeguard, law masquerading as reason. The gallery murmured with quiet agreement born not of malice but of indoctrination. They did not yet recognize the revolution before them, and then she spoke, not in defiance but in clarity. She presented accounts showing increased tenant yields, expenses reduced without compromising welfare, and documented improvements to farmland and livestock care. Her voice was calm, her diction measured, her argument grounded not in emotion but in empirical success. She stood as proof that competence could not be gendered, that stewardship was not a masculine birthright but a human duty. A local farmer stood to speak on her behalf, an act bordering on audacious for a laborer, yet his words were simple and irrefutable. She has done more for us in months than others in years. The magistrate's gaze shifted, surprise giving way to reluctant acknowledgement, the gears of patriarchal certainty grinding against evidence they could not easily dismiss. The petition was denied, not triumphantly but firmly, like a door closed that would not reopen. Returning to Whitmore Manor that evening, Eleanor felt neither jubilation nor relief but something quieter, deeper, self-possession. The estate drive was slick with rain, reflecting lantern light like veins of gold beneath shadow. She stepped from the carriage and breathed in earth and wet leaves, the scent of a world vast beyond legal battles and drawing-room politics. Inside, the staff greeted her not with servile bows but respectful nods, their expressions softened by genuine regard. They had witnessed her transformation, borne silent witness to her evolution from porcelain fragile bride to the architect of her own destiny. The house no longer felt haunted by Thomas's presence. Instead, it felt rooted in hers. But freedom, she knew, was not a destination. It was a practice, a discipline, a vigilance. Patriarchy did not crumble because one woman prevailed. It shifted its weight, recalibrated its tactics, waited for the slightest misstep. Eleanor sensed the truth in the creak of floorboards and the murmur of wind at window panes. Liberation demanded constancy. Winter whispered at the edges of autumn. Fires crackled in hearths, tapestries took on deeper hues, and evening fell early, drawing long shadows across the manor walls. Eleanor used the season to institutionalize her reforms. She created written agreements protecting tenant families from arbitrary eviction and established a modest fund to assist widows of agricultural laborers, an unprecedented act disguised publicly as charitable Christian virtue. Behind closed doors, she drafted a document to ensure that, upon her death without issue, the estate would pass to a distant female cousin rather than default to the nearest male branch of the Whitmore line. Radical, subversive, and shielded by meticulous legal phrasing designed to survive scrutiny, she corresponded with her solicitor in language equal parts cryptic and resolute, embedding her intent in law before those who doubted her could react. Revenge, she had long understood, was rarely righteous if rooted only in retaliation. True retribution lay in restructuring the conditions that once enabled oppression. She did not simply escape the cage, she rearranged its bars so others might walk through. Yet even as she built, she remembered. Trauma did not evaporate simply because justice flickered briefly in her favor. Some nights, when wind howled like distant grief, she woke with clenched fists and a pulse racing from memories that refused erasure. But she did not fear them now. She sat up, lit a candle, opened her journal, and wrote through the tremor, until ink steadied and breath evened. Through writing, she transmuted pain into narrative, silence into record. Words became scaffolding for a future where young women might not enter marriage as children bartered, where consent was not assumed but required, where the sanctity of domestic life did not excuse private brutality. She did not know if such a world would come, but hope wielded in ink held power, quiet, subversive, patient. When spring returned, it came without the innocence of youth but with the tempered strength of survival. Snowmelt fed the river, lambs dotted green fields, and the estate hummed with renewal. Eleanor walked the land daily, boots damp with dew, bonnet tied loosely, unafraid of scrutiny. Children ran to greet her, one offering a wildflower bouquet more heartfelt than any aristocratic salute. She smiled, not as lady of the manor by inheritance but by right earned. Sometimes she paused at the river's bend, watching water rush and eddy. Never still yet always whole, she seemed much the same, movement beneath composure, depth beneath calm. Society did not celebrate her. There were no toasts in gentlemen's clubs or ladies' magazines praising her fortitude. History, as written by men, would not recall her name. But legacy did not need proclamation to endure. It lived in the tenant whose child now learned letters at the school she funded, in the widow who slept without fearing eviction, in the steward who consulted her as equal, and in the land itself, tended, not exploited. And perhaps one day a young woman in some drawing room bound by duty would hear whispers of a widow in Hampshire who refused to surrender and realize silence was not her only inheritance. On a quiet evening, when swallows dipped across a violet sky and candlelight gilded the edges of her writing desk, Eleanor closed her journal and looked toward the staircase once more. It no longer symbolized fate's intervention. It symbolized a threshold crossed. She did not dwell in vengeance. She dwelled in reclamation. Thomas's memory no longer stirred fear nor triumph, but neutrality. Power had shifted not when he fell, but when she rose. She touched the banister briefly, not as relic, but as reminder, and whispered not a vow this time, but a benediction to herself and those who might follow. Let no hand claim ownership of your breath. The hour grew late, and the house settled into warmth and hush. Outside, night unfurled like a protective cloak across the estate. Eleanor Whitmore, once a child bride, once a silenced wife, now lived not as a footnote to a man's lineage, but as author of her own. The world beyond her gate still pulsed with inequity, but here, within these acres and within her own spirit, she had carved a sovereign space, and in that space burned a steady, durable flame, not of rage, but of quiet, enduring revolution.